Hello and welcome to Critical Dragon, where I talk about narrative in film, television, and in books. And a while back, I asked the community, do you have any questions? I was thinking of doing a Q&A video. And there were a number of questions came in, and some have to do with writing, some have to do with editing, some have to do with Malazan specifically, and some really require spoiler answers for Malazan. So I've tried to divide up the questions. And this is going to get separated out into a couple of different videos so that people who don't want spoilers and things like that aren't subjected accidentally to them. So this first video, it's a couple of general questions that people had, as well as some general writing questions. And this is not my first time trying to record this video. I tried to record it outside, and it's Florida, and it's hot. And part of me was melting, while another part of me was starting to smell suspiciously like burning bacon. So I had to come back inside. So I apologize if this is a wee bit echoey, but it's kind of the best that I can do. So let's have a look at some of these general community questions. And I think writing questions in this one. Philip Chase of Philip Chase, The Best of Fantasy, asks, please address how Dr. Fantasy is a way cooler nickname than Professor Fireballs and why your nemesis is so richly deserving of it. Really, Philip? Really? Dr. Fantasy is the perfect nickname for Dr. Philip Chase because he lives in a fantasy world where he thinks he's an expert on fantasy. I'm sorry, what was your PhD in? Medievalism? Honestly, this is the kind of nemesis-like behavior that the world needs to see. Anyway, Philip, I hope you're having a great time with your family, and I'll speak to you soon. But moving on to actual questions. So Louds 9106 said or asked, would you be able to talk about how different authors do characterization? I've seen people criticize Erikson's character development, saying that it's not very good, while others say that it's there. But it's different to other authors. This is an interesting one. How authors communicate characterization. Take, for instance, a police officer speaking to a suspect, and you're in the police officer's point of view. And then take that same scene, and it's the police officer speaking to their child, asking about the same thing, were the sweets stolen? And then a police officer speaking to a judge about the incident of the sweets being stolen, the candy being stolen, sorry for Americans. In each of those different instances, how the police officer speaks is going to be context dependent. How they phrase their questions, the tone with which they use, all of those things. So how a character speaks can reveal a lot about the character. It can also reveal a lot about what they think about the person they are speaking to, as well as communicate the surface level information that is contained within the dialogue. So that is one way of doing characterization, because through the dialogue, if the dialogue is matched to the person speaking and their psychology and their approach, not just the main character, not just what the plot dictates, but actually how that character in that situation would speak and whether it fits with their character, the author can manipulate how we perceive that character. So that's one way of doing it. Another way of doing it, and I've spoken about this before, is focalization. Joe Abercrombie is a great example of this. Each of his point of view chapters, and I believe this is his process, he writes out what happens and the descriptions and the dialogue and the action sequences. Then he goes back through, because not only is it a limited point of view, it's a subjective perception of what is happening in that chapter, limited to that character. It is focalized through that character. So that character is going to think about things in terms relative to them. So if a character is for instance, if a character is very, very short, they might refer to the countertops in a kitchen being very, very tall. If the character is very, very tall, they will think about the countertops in the kitchen being very low. Now, from their point of view, that is objectively true. From an omniscient point of view, the omniscient narrator might say the countertops were at a regular height. So you can see how focalizing the description of what is going on, what a character chooses to focus on and notice, how a character thinks about those things, that can be used to give characterization about that character's worldview and therefore about who they are. So Abercrombie, in rewriting all of the chapters with that psychology in mind, means that each of the chapters feels distinct. If Logan and Glutka are walking along in the same area, they would not pick out the same details. They would not think about those details, even if they both pick them out in the same way. And because of that, the description in the chapters, even though it is not interior monologue, will reflect who the characters are. Another way, obviously, of doing this is have people talk about the characters. This is one of the weakest ways to do it. Oh, that character is brilliant. That character is so intelligent. Where basically other characters tell you what to think about the character. That is a very weak and often blatant way to do it. But it can be useful, particularly if an author then undercuts it. The recent film Glass Onion did this very well, where people were talking about a certain character and saying they're brilliant and wonderful, and then another character's going, no, they're not. You're buying into the image, not the reality. And so because characters have been speaking very overtly about it, it allowed another character to undercut that. So again, it's not that the technique is bad writing. It's how it's deployed, the use that it's going for. But that can go to characterization. Of course, another way of doing it is interior monologue, exposing the character's thoughts and how they feel and what they think about something, because that will tell us more about them. Spending time, pages upon pages, following a character, seeing how they act, how they treat other characters, that will tell us about character. So there are lots of different ways to do characterization beyond exposition that tells you about a character. But quite frequently, particularly in children's, moving into YA, and that style of writing, writing at that level, writing for that audience attention, quite often the author leans into being very explicit about what a character is, who they are, how they feel, making these things very overt, surface level, and explicit, because it's catering to a certain level of reading competency. Or the fact that, maybe people are listening to an audiobook while they're doing lots of other things and they need things more overt. There are lots of different ways of doing it, and it all depends on the style of narrative, on the audience that the narrative is intended for, the age range and expected level of literacy that your audience has. All of these are factors that go into it. Patrick Lugo asked, I would love your thoughts on assassins in fantasy in general, the trope, and in Malazan in particular. This is bizarrely enough, this is actually a complex one. Assassins in fantasy occupy a very strange space. If we find out in real life that someone was an assassin, we would have real trouble with it, because you kill people for money. Someone says, I want that person dead. Here's some money, go and do it. We would not think, oh, they're a warm, cuddly, caring hero character. When we think of assassins in the real world, we are thinking about the real consequences of someone being murdered for money. When it comes to fantasy, because the level of violence is ratcheted up so high beyond our base norm, because the focus of violence in fantasy is often conflating violence with action, and therefore it's no longer violence, it's just action. I think we've become kind of inured to people going around killing a bunch of people. Think of superhero movies. How many superhero movies are there where the hero kills the bad guy? But if people just went around killing everyone, they went, oh, well, he's a criminal, he deserves to be killed, we'd have anarchy. But with assassins, the very concept of it in fantasy, if we think back to rogue classes and running around in a dungeon and lock picking chests and stealing stuff, tomb raiding, thieving, all of these things in games were fine. And I think part of that has kind of infected our perception of what the norm is. So in fantasy, assassins and thieves occupy this very strange space where we're not judging them on the base of essentially what they do. We forget about that. We remove that moral evaluation and we think about it more in terms of, oh, they're really, really cool and they can do all of these cool things. And authors are often quite careful then with their assassin characters to have them only kill bad people and not have them assassinate good, virtuous, wonderful people. And also another thing, because they focus on quite often on an action aspect, they tone down the psychological impact of it. Robin Hobb is someone who really investigates the psychological damage that being an assassin actually might have on someone who isn't a sociopath. It's one of the reasons why I love the realm of the Elderlings so much. It's fascinating. It was one of the first times I remember when I was reading it for the first time. It was the first time in a fantasy novel that the author actually dealt with the psychological ramifications of going out and having to kill a bunch of people and how that would impact the character. For the most part, it's distilled down into the action sort of genre of, yeah, they're an assassin. They go out and they kill people in really cool and sneaky ways. Think of James Bond. James Bond's meant to be a spy and and has a license to kill. So he's an assassin as well for a government. There's a reason for it. But when you look at James Bond's actions in a lot of the movies, and if you think about them through a psychologically real lens and a real world lens, he's just going out murdering people. And he kills guards and all of these other people all the time with no repercussions because we're interested in the action spectacle. We're not thinking about it in those terms. So assassins in fantasy are a really strange class. And it's one of those ones where we sort of all as readers kind of agree in this unspoken compact that we're not really going to think about what it means to be an assassin in the world, and the fact that what they're doing is usually pretty evil. I might do a video on the Malazan assassins because obviously that comes out of games, which is why it popped into my head there. So Carl Albert asked, you wrote your doctoral thesis on the impact of games on fantasy fiction. So what's your history with tabletop games? What sort of characters have you played, or are you the perennial DM? I have far more experience with computer role-playing games. Things like back in the day on the Commodore Amiga, Eye of the Beholder, and then Baldur's Gate, Baldur's Gate 2, all those sort of classic isometric D&D based games. But I have played some tabletop, Shadowrun, Dungeons and well, I think it was Advanced. No, it was Dungeons and Dragons, probably third edition, and a couple of other ones. There was one character that I had rolled up who was a lot of fun to play. Unfortunately, the campaign went nowhere because these things happen. But he was a drunken cleric, and I had borrowed the inspiration for him from a book by Ed Greenwood called Spellfire. And he was a drunken cleric who worshipped the goddess of luck. And so he had a hip flask that was always full of alcohol. It was a magical hip flask, and he was permanently drunk. And in dire emergencies, he also had a sobering up potion in another hip flask that could sober him up. But he couldn't sober up before a fight. It was always the first action that he had to take in a fight. Was if it was a really big fight, then he had to use one of his actions to drink the sobering up potion. But most of the fights, it was no, he went into the fight drunk. And on one particular occasion, he was a cleric. He was the designated support healer sort of person. I accidentally healed one of the people we were trying to kill. It happens. And I found it hilarious. Uh, Other people not so much because it was quite a tough fight. But I had a lot more experience with computer role playing games and with a lot of the fantasy fiction based in computer role playing game worlds. So Dragonlance, Forgotten Realms, Ravenloft, Shadowrun, um, all of these tabletop games that had inspired fiction. So I was reading about a lot of these worlds and seeing how those tropes and structures and mechanics impacted the writing. Um, Trill Nathan asked, I don't know if you've mentioned it, but I'm reading R. Scott Baker's Second Apocalypse books right now. So I'd like to know if you've read them and what you think of them. Baker's work is brilliant. When I read them, they were very dark for me. It wasn't the kind of thing that I wanted to read at the time. But the thing is, they are fantastic. They are very well written. They are very, very dark. And it is a deconstruction and criticism of those things by illustrating how bad these things are. There's a lot of complexity to it. It is fascinating, but ultimately, it was so depressing that when I finished them, I went, I'll have to come back to this when I'm in a different frame of mind. And I've never gone back to them so far. I will at some point. But yeah, if you like grimdark, if you like those that style of storytelling, I can certainly recommend them. But they are challenging, dark, vicious reads. There's some very brutal stuff in it, and it's a fascinating world. And he is a great writer. It's a real shame that he's kind of disappeared. So, a couple of editing and writing questions. Tomo Raider asked, sometimes in people's reviews of books they've read, I've come across a specific point of criticism that certain parts felt off, as if the author was trying to make a point rather than it being an organic part of the character or the narration. I've noticed this often seems to come up, especially around more serious or darker topics. Malazan is an interesting example here because I rarely felt this way, maybe only while reading the Carcanis books, but otherwise I did not feel like the narration took me out of the story. Why do you think some books do not seem to accomplish this, but Malazan largely does? This is actually a really interesting question because one of the frequent complaints about the Malazan Book of the Fallen is Erikson philosophizes too much. Erikson belabors specific political points too much. And there are a number of different reasons for this, and I'll try and cycle through at least some of them. If there is a very serious subject, a subject that you think is very important and you feel strongly about in a certain way, and the author does not treat it that way, it can stand out to you. And you can feel that the author misses the point. The author is not treating this subject the way that it should be treated because this means a lot to you. So it can stand out. Alternatively, if you disagree very strongly with the point being made, it can stand out to you. If you don't like the argument being made, it can stand out to you. And all of that is going to be individual dependent because it's going to depend on the things that you personally care about, your politics, your culture, your ideology. Balanced against that is the fact that sometimes authors have characters say and do things to show things in the negative. Therefore, it's contrasting with our world. So I was just speaking about Baker. Baker leans into all of these really dark aspects to show the ultimate sort of extension of what these beliefs are if you take them to their fullest and you literalize them. And from that, we can reevaluate our position. And a lot of people then mistake that as Baker endorsing that position. And this is the first mistake that a lot of people make is they think that a narrative position is the same as the author's position. And that's not necessarily the case. Quite often, the author is using that to discuss the subject or is using it to challenge a subject or taking a commonly held argument that they disagree with, showing it in the worst possible light, uh, and illustrating it so that they're essentially disproving it by showing how awful it is. There are all sorts of ways to approach that. But if you agree with the position, quite often you don't notice it as much. It doesn't stand out to you. We see this actually with some of the recent last couple of years criticism of woke Hollywood and all this sort of stuff, where they're pointing at things and you go, but that how is that woke? That's just normal. Oh no, but it's blatant and in your face. And I think one of the examples they gave was in one of the recent Spider-Man movies. In the background, for a split second, there was a poster on one of the characters' walls that said, "Support trans kids." They went, look at this woke ideology infecting our movies. So you took, what was it, like a 2 hour movie, and you took half a second in the background and said, "This is, an example of this." When it's perfectly normal for the teenage characters to have these sorts of posters on their wall. It's verisimilitudinous. It's psychologically real. It represents who that character is. It's telling you something about the character. But they viewed it as a direct attack and this sort of woke ideology that's infecting things. Because individually, whether they actually believe it or they're doing it to garner clicks or revenue, they wanted to speak out against it. And they are viewing everything through that lens. If you take books like 1984 or Brave New World or any of the classic dystopias, these are heavily political books making very blatant, obvious points about these politics. And everything in the book, the plot, the characters, is in service of this political discourse that is blatant and it is overt, and the politics of everything that's going on is dictating what is happening. We don't complain about that. But somehow, when it comes to other things, because we think, oh no, but this story should just be this thing, and that's the thing that I'm interested in, and they've included this, therefore I don't like it. And that's the author pontificating or bloviating about something. That's objectionable. Part of it can be our misreading. Part of it can be characters speaking about something. I mentioned this actually about Raymond E. Feist's Magician. In Magician, it's set in Midkemia predominantly, and the Kingdom of the Isles predominantly on Midkemia. And that is a patriarchal feudal society. And in it, the eldest son inherits. So it is heavily patriarchal. And yet all of the good male characters that have grown up in this heavily patriarchal society that has this completely sexist underpinning, all the good male characters are actually feminist in the specific sense of feminism, of treating women equally and treating women as equal to them and having equal rights, which is completely out of character for them, for the world, for their culture, for everything. Now, if they then went on to try to change the culture because they saw this was a problem with their culture, they had these beliefs because something had happened and they changed their mind and they went, you know what, our culture's wrong, and they tried to change it, that would have made more sense. But as it was, this was a way for Feist to get the modern reader on the side of the good characters. Because if the good characters had all been sexist and chauvinist in their attitudes, that would have been harder to like them. Evil characters, on the other hand, could be sexist and chauvinist. And it was a way of going, look, this character is evil and they are sexist and they are chauvinist. That's how evil they are. But when you think about it, they were actually conforming to the base norm of their culture, their world, the reality, the story world, everything. That was normal. And yet it was being shown and used by the author as a way to signify evil. And that stands out because that is clear author manipulation of modern day politics, importing positive aspects onto positive characters, even though it's out of character, and negative aspects of modern day politics onto evil characters, even though that shouldn't have been looked on as evil. And it was absolutely fascinating because you can see it's clearly an author manipulating things for the modern day reader. So it's strange. A lot of this comes down to the individual perception, the lens with which they are reading something, and whether or not they are picking up on the various clues and things that an author has put into the text. You have a lot of videos. Oh, sorry, this is Ozymandias. Ozymandias, King of Kings. Look on my works, ye mighty in despair. You have a lot of videos analyzing prologues and beginnings of books, and plenty analyzing narratives overall, but none that I know of specifically dealing with endings. What advice do you have either writing the end of a story or understanding endings as a reader? This is an interesting one, and it runs into the issue with doing videos on YouTube. And also something I spoke about in a recent video about the differences in media. Because if I want to talk about endings, I go, right, I want to talk about the ending of um, The Way of Kings by Brandon Sanderson. If you haven't read The Way of Kings by Brandon Sanderson, you are almost definitely not going to watch the video because you don't want the ending spoiled. People don't mind you spoiling the beginning of a book because you might only be spoiling the first 3 pages. They go, yeah, that's okay. But they definitely don't want you spoiling the ending of a book. So if I want to talk about the ending of The Way of Kings, I'm already limiting the number of people who are going to listen to it, even if it's a general point about endings. If I make general points about endings, then they'll go, well, what's an example of that? Right. I know I have to go into spoilers for a whole bunch of examples, which is going to spoil the ending of a whole bunch of books. And if one of those books is one that you haven't read, you mightn't want to listen to the video at all. So it's kind of a catch-22. I want to talk about how books end, and I can talk in general about it. But as soon as I start going into examples, people tune out. Um, I could use film, and I know a lot of people do this. And I've done it as well, using films as an example to talk about the general principles. And part of the reason for this is more people have generally seen the big blockbuster movies, and so you can talk about them without fear of spoiling the ending of the film. But how films function structurally as narratives is not necessarily the same as how novels function. They are, in general, films are much more compact, much more focused, and much more closed in terms of the narrative expectations that are being built on. There's usually a single promise being made at the start about how it's going to end. They follow a much clearer, well-defined structure, usually a 3-act play using Freytag's pyramid, maybe elements of Save the Cat. But they're looking at these structural approaches, and a lot of it maps onto very neatly Freytag's pyramid. And therefore, there's not really a lot of interesting things to say about how they end, apart from when they suddenly change what the ending is to conform to an expected reality, even though that's not what the narrative promised. Iron Man, the Iron Man trilogy with Robert Downey Jr., perfect example of this. Iron Man 1, the bad guy at the end, Ironmonger, comes out of nowhere. And it could have been integrated into the film at a much earlier level or a much earlier point. And it would have felt more seamless by making, I think, last time I went through it, there was like 2 scene changes. And it was a drop insert of maybe 3 lines of dialogue, 4 lines of dialogue, would have actually made that feel much more seamless. But when you move on to Iron Man 2, it's essentially exactly the same story as Iron Man 1. And in it, because Whiplash is set up as an evil character because he is dirty and he is Russian and he is grubby and he is poor, he is the opposite of Tony. We forget that all of the information we're given about him is that he is a victim. And the whole premise of the second Iron Man movie is Tony dealing with the ramifications and repercussions of the sins of the father and trying to redeem his father and himself. It's a redemption story. And yet it then falls into, oh no, we're just going to have a fight with the bad guy at the end, instead of using that as a way to resolve and redeem the person who was mistakenly called a villain, save them. And you could have had either Ironmonger sacrifice himself to save Tony or join Tony and take down the ultimate bad guy. Iron Man 3 is even worse. All the way through, you're told that the military vets who have been experimented on with the extremis virus are victims, and Tony needs to go and see them. And then suddenly, in at about the 2/3 mark, no, no, they're all just bad guys. They're mindless goons who can now be killed. And in those circumstances, you can see how the narrative was building up and making you feel a certain way and was laying groundwork and foundation work for this is the direction of the narrative. And then it just takes a left turn at the traffic lights. And suddenly, oh no, we just need a big, lots of robots fighting lots of glowy people at the end of Iron Man 3 for no reason. And what makes it even worse is about a day and a half later, he finds a cure for the extremis virus and cures Pepper. And so, like, even if you'd wanted that at the end, that they'd laid information that the extremis virus made people go insane eventually and become sociopathic, that at least could have laid the groundwork for why at the end they're all just mindless uh, henchmen who can be killed. But even then, they could have leaned into the victim aspect by Tony having found and researched, or Jarvis having found and researched the cure, finding the missing link, so that the suits could shoot darts and inject them with something that temporarily knocked out the extremis virus so they could be captured and then cured at a later date. You could have had exactly the same thing, but instead of killing them all, they could have been using trank darts that would have done that. So you would have had the exact same spectacle of the action sequence without needlessly killing them all. The bad guy was Killian. So in general, endings are about some of the things that are promised at the start and whether there is narrative closure. That narrative closure can occur by closing off all of the avenues for the story to develop further. It can close off the main avenues. It can resolve the issues that were raised in that particular volume. And we see this in series where, in a series, so take something like The Wheel of Time, each book has a thing that the characters are doing. And that thing is generally resolved to a certain level of satisfaction or closure at the end of the volume. But there's an overarching structure of the major problem in The Wheel of Time is the Dark One, and that is going to be resolved by the end of the series. So you can have multiple threads running through a series thread as well as a novel thread. Another way of thinking about this is if you think of a series as on the macro scale, a novel as the standard scale, but on a micro scale, you can think about that structure applying to chapters or to scenes, where at the beginning of the scene, it is doing this thing and then the scene resolves. It's about closing out the actions or sequence. It's about providing a sense of finality to something or promising a development that is going to lead from a resolution within that. There are so many different ways of doing it, and it is very difficult to discuss without going into specific examples and potentially ruining books for people. Eugene Murphy asked, what is my best general editing advice when your first draft is complete? Give it your first read over and focus mostly on X. This is, again, it's a difficult one simply because every manuscript, every novel is different and it requires different things. One of the techniques that I think can be very, very useful to new writers, and this is a very crude, rough and ready, unrefined approach, but it is a great first step in editing. If you have multiple POVs in a work, or if you divide it up even into chapters, go through each chapter in sequence, get a table, and you go chapter 1, scene number, point of view, and or type of narration, main character, number of words. So you have this table and you go through and you look at chapter 1, and chapter 1 has 3 scenes. How long is the first scene? What point of view is being used? Who is the main character? What are the main actions that occur in it? How many words did it take up? Scene 2. do the same thing. And you finish off chapter one. Then you go on and you repeat this for chapters all the way through. The reason this is a good, rough and ready, crude, brutal, brute force tool is you can look at that and you can see where, if you've had a point of view character, where you maybe have been spending 3/4 of a novel with that point of view character in terms of word count, but not in terms of the number of times that they appear. Or you can see where you think you've been balancing viewpoints. I move from this character point of view to that character point of view. I've been alternating. And yet, character A is always getting chapters of 5,000 words. Character B is always getting chapters of 2,500 words. So suddenly you see in raw numbers how you have done things. By writing out what the major actions are in a scene, you get an overview of how you're progressing through the novel, the things that are being picked up, the things that you want to communicate. So when you go through and you're doing your line by line edit, you can just refer to that just as a blanket cheat sheet. Not every author works this way. This isn't going to work for every author, but it can be an incredibly useful tool to see where sections are long, where sections are short. And then when you go into those sections, the short section might be a big action sequence with lots of compressed, punchy dialogue and action happening. So it rips along. You go, yeah, I want that there. That is to spur and to generate new interest. That works. But the next section is incredibly long. Maybe that can be shorter because I'm moving out of a fast action sequence. I want to give the reader time to take a breath, but do I really want basically 3 times the length of that action chapter in pausing and character moments? It's just an easy cheat sheet for looking at how you can balance and get some idea of one aspect of pacing. And that it's just a nice structural overview. It's not always going to be appropriate. Not everyone will get use out of it, but it can be very handy. Eugene also asked, besides Sight, what is the sense you feel new and old writers never hit as well as the others? Sight obviously is quite often the main sense that's used. It's describing how things look. Sound is usually encompassed quite a lot because we have a lot of dialogue, which naturally we sound out in our heads. Sound in terms of sound effects and the squelching through mud, all the sort of onomatopoeic words, if they're used judiciously, they can be wonderful, enriching sounds, particularly squelching, because not only is it onomatopoeic, but it has a tactile sense. And I think tactile sensations and smell are 2 greatly underused senses in making worlds seem real, in making fiction seem real. Taste is often used specifically for food and drink, despite the fact that it's taste and smell are wonderful in circumstances where you wouldn't think they would be. In epic fantasy, we've all seen those sequences where there's a battlefield and it's the aftermath of the battle and people are dead and dying and beasts are keeled over and oh, it's devastating. The smell of that battlefield, the taste of that battlefield can really sell the horror of it, because the blood that is pulled out everywhere is going to have that iron tang to it. The viscera that's spilled out of people's guts and the fact that their bowels and stomachs have been opened and their contents spilled everywhere, that stuff is going to smell a particular way. And we all know how really overpowering smells get into the back of your throat so that you're tasting the air. And so by adding in those details, an author can really sell the horror of a battlefield. In the same way, for a completely opposite reaction, the beautiful summer meadow with the gentle summer sun shining and the hero is lying down in the warm grass and looking at the blue sky and the clouds. That smell of the flowers and the pollen and the fresh wind, little details about how it smells, can really create a sense of the place. So sight and sound, I think, dominate. And a lot of that has to do with the impact of audiovisual media, film, television, all these sorts of things on how we read. They are quite often the formative modes of narrative that we encounter growing up while we develop our reading. And people naturally feel comfortable with that. It's also how the vast majority of people engage with the world. And yes, I know that some people are blind, some people are deaf. But if we're going to make a broad generality, sight and sound are how the majority of people engage with the world. So, assuming that as a default norm, particularly in line with the storytelling that we're used to from growing up before we could read, all of these things lean into those being used as the dominant forms of description. And tactile senses, the smell and taste of things, are often overlooked. And yet you can just imagine when a character puts their hand on table and they feel the grain of the wood, that makes the table seem somehow more real. If, oh, there's a banquet table, it's rough hewn planks, that makes the thing come more alive because we're describing the texture. So it's not always about feeling it, but even describing the textures of things can sometimes make the world come more alive. The problem is obviously certain authors fall into describing far too much, and we can have a page and a half about, you know, how someone's hair is tied and the clothes that they are wearing and what they are eating, and it's long pages of description of these things. Everything in moderation. It's an expression from home. But there are a couple more questions here about editing, and I think this has gone on long enough. So what I'll do is I will do a separate video specifically about some of these editing questions, and then I'll do another video on the Malazan stuff. So thank you very much for watching. Thank you for your continued support, and I will see you in the next one.